Hello, I'm Dr. Annadale, and our text today is The Problem with Modernity. This is a section of the introduction to Bishop Robert Barron's 2002 book, The Strangest Way, Walking the Christian Path. Now, Barron begins this section with an observation that some of his seminarians made on a trip to the Holy Land. They noticed that during the holy month of Ramadan, Muslim faith and religious practice informed every element of the social sphere. That is, it affected the way people ate, the way they slept, the way they conducted commerce. There was nothing left untouched by religious faith, and this contrasted with the seminarians' experience of Catholicism in the public square in their native Chicago. Despite a large number of Catholics, Catholicism was not nearly so in your face, to use Barron's expression, as Islamic practice was in the region of the Holy Land they visited. My first question for you, therefore, is being in your face, loud, proud, and in public, is this a suitable ideal for American Christians? Is this something that we as Catholics would be comfortable with if it were, say, the Southern Baptists or the Mormons, who were the Christians being loud, proud, and in your face in the public square? That's a point for further discussion later. Barron goes on to talk about one problem, and I think there's a related problem as well. He's talking about the deculturalization of Christianity, and I would add that the converse of that is the Dechristianization of culture. That is to say, both religion and culture have changed in the time period Barron's talking about in America. Culture has been dechristianized, and Christianity has been deculturized. It's lost its public voice or its weight in the public square. Barron goes on to do some very quick analysis of modern philosophy, and he traces the roots of this phenomenon back to what he calls Descartes' wrecking ball philosophy. Specifically, Descartes' subjectivism, his anti-traditionalism, and most of all his exaggerated rationalism. What comes out of this philosophy, then, is a vision of the human person as a disembodied reason, and we find, therefore, a body-spirit split that comes to characterize even Christian theology after Kant and Schleiermacher, for example. Barron contrasts this with von Balthasar's call for a kneeling theology, that is, a theology conducted by Christians who are imbued in the practices of the church, as, say, the theologian Paul Tillich was not at the time of writing his systematic theology. What Barron is really after here is, I think, the loss of the physical and bodily elements of the life of faith. These are the things that he identifies as practices. And in the following section, Back to Practices, Barron discusses a few 19th and 20th century figures who he thinks dissent from this modern rationalism. He discusses briefly Wittgenstein's language games, Goethe's poetic method, and William James's insight into the role of the body and of practices in knowing and believing. He also talks about Newman's observation that assent means something more than just formal inference. We don't know that England is an island because we have compelling rationalist proof for it, for example. As far as James goes, I would add in a word for Pascal, who I think reaches many of the same conclusions several centuries earlier, as we'll see when we read Pascal later. Barron, in this section, has a couple of meaningful quotes. He talks about reaching the truth by a process of quasi-rational play, and he says also that the thinkers he's cited know that knowing is a bloody and muddy process. I invite you to reflect upon just what those expressions might mean. Barron goes on to discuss Christianity as a form of life, as a way of living that has not just rational and mental, but also bodily elements. He says we know by moving from the beautiful to the good to the true, and that it is the characteristic error of modernity to reverse this order. I've said before that Catholic philosophers have this error of assuming that when we can prove something is true, we've finished what we have to do. We've shown that it's true, and therefore we can say, hey guys, this is true, and therefore you should regard it to be good, and you should love it as being beautiful. And Barron says this is precisely the opposite of the order in which we should proceed. I'll also put in a word here for Pascal, who I think has something to say on precisely this question. A couple of comments to wrap up. I want to note that to be an apprentice in a practice, as Barron discusses, means a couple of things. It means to submit yourself to the authority of senior practitioners. It means to enter into a tradition and regard the institutions of the tradition as being authoritative for you as an apprentice of the practice. And it means most especially to work to develop a faculty of taste, that is, to develop a sense of the characteristic judgments of the connoisseur of the practice. And as a philosophy teacher and a philosopher, that's part of my ambition for you, is that you would develop a sense of philosophical taste, that you would know not simply what the arguments are surrounding utilitarianism, but in a sense what utilitarianism tastes like, what its particular flavor is, the way that a connoisseur of wine knows something about the characteristic crispness of a Chardonnay. Second observation that I'll leave you with, and a question, is that Modernist Christianity, I think especially in Kant, reduces Christian belief to a system of ethics and a play of the emotions. Christianity becomes ethics plus emotion. What else is needed? According to Barron, what's needed are practices. So my question for you to conclude is, what sorts of practices would be needed to make Christianity into a living practice and not just a system of ethics and a system of emotional satisfaction in community? What sorts of practices and why? Why these practices and not some others? That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.